Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Finca Maputo honey processed Ecuador from Imbibe Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Imbibe, based out of Dublin, Ireland, and this is their first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. This is also part one of our 4-part series featuring the Right Roasts Ireland subscription box. And this coffee is one of the ones that caught my interest the most from that set, as this is a honey processed Típica Mejorado. And for all of the Mejorado coffees that we have reviewed, we have never reviewed any that were honey processed. So this felt like a great opportunity to review one, and we'll see how it turned out, as this right here is day 41. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I actually like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So this one was a little bit more developed than initially expected going into it, and I feel like the best contemporary I can kind of relate it to is 3FE, which is also on the slightly more developed side of things, which is to say that this one's either a medium or maybe on the slightly lighter side of that medium. And since this is our first time reviewing this coffee roaster, I do believe that the actual machine that they use for this is the Gießen. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 16, first impression, and we ran it to the V60, and it was interestingly more heavy and developed than initially expected going into it, as I do believe that this is technically their filter roast of this coffee. It was offering a fair bit of fermentiness at the forefront with some strong perfumey aspects as well as some slight roastiness. So I did go into this one with some very high expectations, wondering if we were going to be able to pull out some of the Mejorado-like characteristics of this coffee. But I feel like it might have been dominated a little bit by the processing of it, lending itself towards maybe not necessarily the best first impression. We move on to day 19 as we opted for the Chemex, and once again it was offering similar characteristics, with the rest of the cup being pointed in a slightly more citric tone. So I do believe they have something along the lines of a candied orange on here, which did make a little bit of sense given that there was plenty of citric aspects within this one. It was intense yet again, with a lingering heaviness throughout as well as a very long-lasting finish, so once again, not necessarily the best second impression. We move on to day 22 as we opted for the April brewer, and the cup has been pretty consistent to this point as there is more of the heavy aspects present throughout. It was slightly toned down in that regard with a little bit more clarity, as well as the candied orange aspects are felt a little bit better through this brew method. It was still very dominant in the perfumey jasmine-like components within this one, so once again, a little bit too heavy for me. But we move on to day 25 as we opted for the V60 with Imbibe's recipe, which was lower temperatures and a higher concentration, and it did not necessarily feel quite as structured, with a little bit more heaviness relative to some of the previous experiences. And honestly, that's the way I would have gone with this coffee, is I probably would have toned down the temperatures to maybe reduce some of the heaviness and some of the, so we'll say, slightly more smoky qualities of it. But it didn't necessarily seem to help, and I thought it was interesting that they went a lot more concentrated on it as well. Nonetheless, the listed mint quality was a little bit more pronounced now, so I would say there was a heavier berry tone in line with just heavier processed coffees in general. So that's basically to say a little bit more of that kind of darker berry cherry-like aspect to it, lending itself towards another just okay day. We move on to day 28 as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it was offering a similar result with the heaviness of the berry and the perfumey florals once again dominating. There is a bit more after an extended cool down, as there's a slight caramelized sweetness that can be felt with a little bit more of the herbality as well. Day 31 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and this was a little better. And oftentimes when it comes to coffees that may have some slightly more undesirable qualities that I am experiencing, so whether that be some heaviness or whether that be some roastiness, then typically I say, is the trade-off worth it? Is the intensity that we're getting from just maybe pushing this coffee a little bit more worth not necessarily toning down those aspects? And in the case with this coffee, I would say that it was, as this felt improved from not only the last couple of experiences that we had, but from the initial impressions, as the heaviness was slightly more toned down regardless, with some more prominent sweeter citric tones. Herbality and intense dark fruits and florals were still the most abundant characteristics, but I said, okay, I'm not feeling it quite as harsh as it had been on some of the earlier days. Day 34 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and this was the best the cup had been by far to this point, as it was offering a little bit more clarity, and that's all I was really searching for, was perhaps a little bit more clarity, because this coffee was just a little too heavy for the majority of the time that we'd been drinking it. With significantly less of that heaviness, there was a little bit more candied sweetness that could be felt, and as a result, it was a much better cup. Day 37, final notes we have, one last try through the Chemex, and it was at its best with a slightly more even version of an otherwise consistent cup. And I do have to say that this coffee was very consistent, and the tinkering and adjustments we had made seemed to either highlight a lot of the more heavier aspects of it, or it seemed to tone those down, but for the most part, the profile within it was very similar regardless. Herbality and slight candied sweetness this time around, so just a little bit more depth to it as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5 and then a handful of level 4. So let's start with the level 5, the finish. And as I've kind of alluded to early on, it did have a very long lasting finish. And unfortunately, it's coming in that finish that I can say is a little overbearing. So a lot of those heavier berry aspects, a lot of those more perfumey floral aspects were there. But as we're looking at the rest of this tasting wheel, you can see that it didn't necessarily seem to dominate too much to the point where the rest of the cup was overbearing. I was just really surprised at how extended of a finish there was in regard to those qualities within this coffee. Sweetness, level 4. So unsurprisingly, it was a very sweet coffee, but given that it's a Mejorado, I was fully expecting and hoping it to score that level 5, but not in an overbearing sense. And if anything, I'm glad that by the end it turned out that level 4, since if it had been a level 5 and the coffee was already a little too heavy for me, then it wouldn't have necessarily gone in line with that, as that probably would have made this coffee a little bit more intense in the sense that I wasn't necessarily enjoying. So I'm happier that it finished at that level 4, as it still seemed to offer just a lot of that intensity to it. Acidity, level 4, and I do have to say that that was kind of surprising given a lot of the characteristics within this coffee, but that jasmine-like aspect, it was such a strong, perfumey jasmine-like, correction, it's the acidity. There was so much brightness to this coffee, and I was just kind of surprised at how much there was given the profile of this coffee, given that it felt like it had a little bit more to it. But I think for that reason, I just felt that this coffee was perhaps slightly more uneven than expected going into it. Florality, level 4, and we were already just discussing that, as there's some very strong perfumey jasmine aspects within this one, and if anything, it's on the higher side of level 4. It's verging on that level 5 as well, given just how much of an intensity there was in that sense. Grapefruit, level 4, and as mentioned, there's plenty of that cherry-like aspect to it. I forgot what the other note that they had listed on here. I don't think it was any sort of berry note, but I could definitely feel a fair bit of that in a much more heavy sense, so level 4 felt fitting for it. Citrus fruit, level 4, and there was a little bit of that sweeter citric quality, and when I was experiencing that, I would say that that was maybe the more enjoyable part of this. So what they say, candied orange, something like tangerine I could also see, but outside of that, I think that maybe those were the best highlights from that level 4 within this coffee. Then we have a bunch of level 3s, the spice level 3. I do recall that they have some sort of minty quality on here, and I could kind of see that as it's kind of in that spiced, sort of savory herbal sense to this coffee. And I would say that that's a little bit more in the intermediary end, given that this coffee is a little bit more dominated by some of the other themes and tones of this one. It wasn't necessarily the most prominent aspect at any time within it. And then we have the chocolate level 3. Typically that's associated with slightly more heavy coffees, as I could say I was getting a lot more of that, given that this coffee had a fair bit of heaviness to it. Bitterness, level 3, and unfortunately for me, that is the coffee bitterness, as there was a little bit of that as well, with which went along with the profile. Body level 3, so it had a fair bit of texture to it, as well as this one was a little bit more medium bodied, and I kind of wanted to skip through those things so we could discuss the really big parts of this coffee, which was the cleanliness and the smokiness, and obviously those go hand in hand to a certain extent. So I think that the cleanliness probably would have scored a level 3 if it was maybe void of one of the aspects, whether it be that it was a little bit more fermenty and processed than I would like, or whether it be that it was a little bit more smoky than I like. And I think level 3 is perhaps a little harsh within this coffee, but I did want to highlight just how it had a little bit more of that characteristic to it than the vast majority of the coffees that we do review. And since it's very rare that we review any coffees that do score at that level 4, level 5, or even level 3 mark, I just kind of wanted to demonstrate that it had a little bit more of that relative to the vast majority of coffees that we do review. So that seems tended to cleanliness, knocking it down from what you would hope for from a 4 from a honey processed coffee to a 3. And then in addition to that, the fermentiness did seem to impact this coffee, bumping it down even further to a 2, as I would feel that this coffee was perhaps just a little bit more heavy in those certain aspects for me. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like it's safe to say this one was certainly a victim of expectations. And when it comes to a coffee like this, I always like to put it on myself that I couldn't necessarily get this coffee right. And I oftentimes feel like I don't necessarily have the tools to work with a coffee like this, as I feel like this coffee was just a little bit away from certain things I use. Like I feel like my water is too soft for this coffee. And I also feel like a lot of the adjustments I made weren't necessarily going to help this coffee, as I feel like this one just skewed a little bit more in an intense direction that I kind of lacked the ability to really tone down. And I feel like if I was able to get a little bit more clarity and kind of tone this coffee down, then even then it's skewed in a profile that isn't necessarily to my own preference, as it had so many of those berry-like aspects, which aren't necessarily things that I enjoy. And given that I was hoping for so many of the Mejorado-like components, most specifically that sweetness and that brown candied aspect, neither of those were necessarily overly present within it, and it could just be a result of the processing within this coffee, and it could just be that I'm just not a big fan of this coffee in particular. But for whatever the reason was with this one, it just didn't turn out with the expectations that I'd had for it going into it, which is a little unfortunate given that a honey processed Mejorado coffee sounds very exciting, especially one that's roasted on the Gießen, which is a coffee roaster that I very much enjoy as well. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you do like those slightly more intense coffees, most specifically in that berry-like sense, and that's a really good place to start with it. In addition to those very strong perfumey, floral-like aspects, those two things are present within this one in notable abundance. In addition to that, if you do like a little bit more of a developed profile to your coffee as well, I feel like this one also fits in line with that. It's still offering some really nice sweetness, and it's still offering some nice depth as well, including that more sweet side of the citric component. And then in addition to that, a very long-lasting finish. So there are a number of things that you can enjoy and pull away from this one. I also feel like it's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Finca Maputo, honey processed Ecuador from Imbibe Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.